And I'd like to start off by, first of all, just highlighting some points of agreement that I have with Megan and with also other speakers that have spoken today. And one is that every person who is dying should have access to high quality palliative care. And absolutely, I think that's a universal statement we all agree with. We'd also agree that advanced care planning has a very important role to play in end-of-life decisions. We would also agree that every competent person has the right to refuse treatment that they don't want. And I think also from what Megan said, we would also agree that modern medicine and palliative care cannot always prevent all suffering. So we actually do start from a number of points of agreement. I guess the fundamental area where we disagree is a statement of values or human rights. And that is that we believe that competent adults should be able to make decisions about their own life or death. And that's, I guess, we're talking here about mentally competent adults, not people who have dementia or have advanced psychiatric illness. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the sort of people that belong to our organisation, to Dying with Dignity, and why they join. One person, this is Pam Bell, who actually is an old colleague of mine. She's a woman who retired academic. She had breast cancer in the 1990s. Her cancer has been treated and appears to be in remission and is fine. But she's someone that is aware that with cancers they sometimes come back, and it's very important for Pam to know that if it should come back and if she's in a position where she is suffering, that she will be able to take control over the timing and manner of her death. Another example is John Hogan, who was an active member in Dying with Dignity and was diagnosed with secondary cancer, bowel and secondary liver cancer in 2011. And his cancer has spread to a number of sites in his body. He's had a number of operations. He's been on chemotherapy a number of times, and he's in the more advanced stages of cancer. John hopes to live as long as possible and as well as possible, and we're all hoping that he continues to stay well. But he's also someone that worries about how things will be in the end, and he also wants to know that if things become intolerable, he will be able to take control over the manner of his death. And the other person that some of you may have seen, because she's one of our most active and vocal advocates for legalisation of assisted dying, is Loredana. And Loredana has advanced multiple sclerosis, which has gradually made her more and more disabled. Up until a couple of years ago, she was still able to use her left hand. And you talk about autonomy, and why is autonomy important? Well, people will fight for autonomy for their last breath. And the importance of being able to use even a small part of a hand, even a finger, even being able to control very small areas of their life is important to most people. And as a psychologist, I would say it's probably a very normal and common human need, and that is to exercise some autonomy. But Loredana is now in the stage where her eyesight is being affected by the disease as well as her ability to speech, and she's heading for the stage where she will not be able to communicate, not be able to move any part of her body, and be totally at the mercy of the disease before it eventually kills her. Loredana is someone who fought very strongly for and hoped very strongly that Kate's bill, the rights of the terminally ill bill, would be passed, because she would like to know that when her suffering becomes intolerable, she will have the right to die. And Australians do want change. If we look at national polls over the years, really they were first taken in the 1960s, we can see that more and more people are responding to the question, if somebody is terminally ill and suffering and has no hope for recovery, should they be able to get assistance, medical assistance, to end their lives? And the majority of the Australian population answer in the affirmative. Now, that doesn't mean every person is going to then take advantage of the law if it should come about, and I think I do agree with Megan that in the end a lot of people choose alternative paths, and that's absolutely fine. But they agree with the principle that people should have the right to choose the timing and manner of their death, particularly if they are dying and suffering. And we know that changes are happening overseas, and a number of countries have introduced laws, and it's now moving ahead. We know that in the United States, 4 states have already legalised assisted dying, and more states are now currently debating the bills. Netherlands, it's been legal since 2000, Belgium since 2002, Luxembourg recently. And Australia was actually one of the pioneer countries that introduced euthanasia, you may recall, assisted dying, not euthanasia, in 1996. But unfortunately, the rights of the territories to rule on this matter was overturned by the Commonwealth Government. Some of you may recall that period. The other thing that I guess we need to be aware of is euthanasia already happens in Australia. There have been a number of studies that have shown, anonymous studies, where doctors know that they will not be prosecuted because their responses are anonymous. A number of studies have shown that doctors are already performing euthanasia. And one study of 683 Australian surgeons found that 36% said that they had deliberately provided medication with the sole intention of deliberately hastening death, or at least with that intention. Another study of Victorian doctors found very similar figures, that 35% of doctors, when asked anonymously, agreed that they had provided drugs with the intention of hastening death. And still an earlier study of, a large study of Australian doctors found that euthanasia accounts for about 1.8% of Australian deaths. And of those cases of euthanasia, 3.5% happen without the explicit consent or request of the patient. Now, does that mean that these patients... And it was interesting to hear what Nicholas Cowdery said, because it makes me think, well, technically, is that murder? You know, they are actually taking life without the explicit consent of the patient. In some cases, the patient may have said beforehand that if that should happen, they would like to get assistance. In some case, family members ask for assistance. In some case, the doctor is just performing a compassionate act because they can see that the person is suffering and has no hope of recovery. But this is something that we must acknowledge, and it happens not only in overseas countries where euthanasia is legal, it's also happening in other countries like Australia where it is not legal. So what's the problem? If people are already getting assistance to help them die, why do we need legislative change? And one of the problems is that it's happening in a very, very covert way. It's unmonitored. It's often happening at a very advanced stage. And a lot of people would like the right to be able to make choices about their life and death at an earlier stage. Also, the other issue is getting a doctor who is likely to assist in this area very much depends on connections or luck. So in some cases, people know that this particular doctor in this hospital with a wink and a nod may help, may provide some medication to assist somebody. But in other palliative care hospitals, or other hospitals generally, that option is not available. So it's inequitable and unfair that some people are able to get that assistance and some people aren't. And I guess for the patient, one of the most important things is reassurance. It may be they will never take advantage of assisted dying, but they want to know that it's available if their suffering should become too great. We know that a number of patients are now doing workshops, sorry, not just patients, but individuals are doing workshops or attending workshops to find out how they can take responsibility for their own death if the time comes. And we know that Nembutal is one of the most commonly sought after drugs because it generally leads to a peaceful death. The problem is it's illegal, it's anxiety provoking, it's often bought from overseas. That people are being scammed in some cases and prosecutions are taking place. There are a number of other really unpleasant, or perhaps not necessarily unpleasant, but difficult ways of dying. And some of them involve things like carbon monoxide, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. People are doing workshops to learn how to do that, but they are undignified, they are distressing, they often involve putting a plastic bag over your head and pumping various gases into that plastic bag. And even though they may in some cases lead to a peaceful death, it's a very distressing death. And anyone who assists a person in that situation, again, risks prosecution, as Nicholas pointed out. There's also the overseas option of going to dignitas, where in Switzerland, where assisted dying is legal, but for Australians that generally isn't viable. If someone is ill enough to want assisted dying, they're usually too ill to travel. Dignitas is used quite widely by people from Europe, and apparently people from Germany and the UK are the most common people who go there for assisted dying. One of the things I guess I wanted to point out is when we look at opposition, and especially really trenchant opposition to changing the law and making assisted dying legal and accessible to people, it is very often and most often promoted by people who have a very strong religious ideology. But unfortunately that is very rarely declared. People rarely come out and say, look, the reason I think that this should never be legal is because only God gives life and only God has the right to take it away. But it is that ideology that underpins most of the most trenchant opposition. So instead of saying that, we hear all sorts of other stories. Stories like doctor becomes killer. And I noticed even in Megan's talk there is reference to killing patients. The word killing implies violation against a person. And to imply that, you know, this is a violation, if somebody is ill, suffering, and desperately wanting assistance to help them die, then it is an act of compassion from a doctor to help rather than an act of violation. Other sort of terms that are bandied around is slippery slope. It will start off voluntary, but it'll end up involuntary. All sorts of scare tactics. And comments like, you know, the vulnerable will be targeted. By the way, I was interested to see the study that Megan was referring to, where she said that in Holland, great numbers of people are being euthanized against their will. You'll notice that the date on that study was 1991. Legalisation in Holland occurred in 2002. So whatever statistics they were referring to then were gathered before legalisation occurred.
It has continued on the same.
Well, but you're providing statistics from a period for which euthanasia was not legal. And these are many of the sort of comments and the sort of strategies that are being used to convince people that this is a terrible thing and that people are going to be euthanized against their will, that, you know, elder abuse is going to happen. Most of the arguments that are put out are highly emotive and focus on scare tactics, misinformation and fear-mongering. We know from research where countries where assisted dying is legal, there is extensive monitoring, there's extensive reporting of cases. The numbers of people who access assisted dying are small and have not increased significantly over time. We know that in the Netherlands, for example, in 2001, 2.8% of all deaths were assisted dying. In 2010, 2.9% of all deaths were assisted dying. There are some fluctuations in between, but generally less than 3% in the Netherlands, where the criteria, by the way, in the Netherlands is not just terminal illness, but is intolerable suffering that cannot be remediated. So generally, some legislatures that use that criteria have higher rates of assisted dying compared to countries where only terminal illness is accepted as a criteria. In Belgium, the rates have been between 1% and 2% since 2002 when it was legalised. And in Oregon, it was basically where only terminal illness is acceptable as a reason for assisted dying. It's been between 0.3 of 1% and 0.5 of 1%. So basically very small numbers. Just to give you an example of the Washington report, and Washington's had legalised assisted dying for the last few years. In 2011, 103 prescriptions were written. The people who take advantage, unlike some of the cries that it's going to be the poor, the blacks, the vulnerable, in fact are people who are predominantly white, educated, insured, not financially vulnerable. Majority have had cancer. Some of them had ALS and other neurological, really unpleasant neurological diseases. 70%, so 103 prescriptions were written. 70 of those people actually took the medication, which is interesting as well, because a number of people who have the prescriptions written actually don't take it, but they want it as an insurance, so that if their suffering should become too great, that they will be able to take it. So of those 70 who did take it, 93% died at home. And this is one of the things that most people want. They want the option to be able to die at home. I'm not saying everyone wants euthanasia or assisted dying, but people often want to be able to exercise that right. And 83% were enrolled in hospice care, but in the end didn't go there. Interestingly also, and I agree with Megan, pain is not the main concern. The majority of people who are concerned about, or who wanted assisted dying, were concerned about loss of autonomy, becoming so weak and so unwell that they could no longer have a meaningful and satisfying life, that they had lost their dignity, that they needed assistance with the most basic, fundamental human needs. The whole myth about patients already have autonomy, which our opponents sometimes argue, they already have autonomy. They don't need any more autonomy because they can write an advanced care directive. I think, as Colleen very rightly pointed out, advanced care directives mainly specify what you don't want. They don't actually allow you to specify that you want assistance to help you die. And you can tattoo "do not resuscitate" on your neck or even on your forehead. And that's not going to help you die if you don't have a stroke or a heart attack or something that will require resuscitation. And the right to withdraw life-prolonging treatment, it is true that some people are on all sorts of equipment and sometimes medication to keep them alive, but that's not true for the majority of people. The majority of people who are dying have palliative treatment, which is meant to control pain and unpleasant physical symptoms, and taking them off, they're not on life-prolonging treatment. The right to refuse food and fluids is another example of where people are saying, well, they don't need assisted dying, they can just choose to not eat and not drink, and over time they will die. And yes, that is a right, but why should we? Why should people be reduced to having to withdraw or not take food and fluid when they want the option of dying now? And when we're talking about autonomy, what people want is autonomy, and I think that's a basic human right. Autonomy means respecting the rights of the patient in relation to how they want to die. We already respect the rights of the patient in terms of, the type of funeral they want, whether they want cremation, whether they want their ashes to be scattered, the type of music they want played at their funeral, etc., etc. We already have a great emphasis on respecting patients' rights. Why can't we respect this right, which fundamentally goes to who we are? And by the way, the comment that people who have cancer and want to die are depressed is absolute nonsense. There is a small percentage who are clinically depressed, but it is only a small percentage. And the bill that Kate Fairman was presenting, which was the Rights of the Terminally Ill Bill, specifically required psychiatric assessment and would exclude anyone who was suffering from mental illness and would therefore, may be affected in terms of their judgment. I've just about finished. Just in terms of the argument that palliative care is the answer, I think we both agree that palliative care doesn't always prevent suffering. And many people don't want to go into hospice or palliative care. Many people want to die at home. I want to very quickly talk about my own father's experience. Sadly, I had the personal experience of witnessing palliative care last year when my father was dying from terminal stomach cancer. And he was in one of the best palliative care facilities in Australia, Cabrini Hospital in Melbourne, fabulous place, and I cannot speak highly enough of the care that he got there. Nevertheless, he had enormous suffering, and the most difficult for him, as someone who's always been independent and in control of his life, was the loss of every last ability to do things for himself. The feeling humiliated with toileting and wearing nappies and self-care, as well as things like bed sores and oral thrush, and in the end not being able to swallow and dehydration. And in spite of the best care, he was still had to suffer. And unfortunately, maybe it's true that some people find grace in suffering. Unfortunately, not everyone does, and certainly my father didn't. We support assisted dying for 3 reasons: human rights, and I believe it should be a fundamental human right to make a decision about how we live and die; democracy, and that is accepting that the vast majority of the population support this law; and compassion. The people who are suffering should not be forced to continue to suffer for a period of time if they specifically request the right to die. This is an argument that is not about choosing between life and death. This is an argument about how we die. Thank you.